This is new Patreon series 56A. We're going to talk about my new book called The Gospel of Yeshua, Part 1, why I wrote this book and how I structured it. Now, this book looks like this. This is the cover, The Gospel of Yeshua. There are many other Gospel of Yeshua type books that you will find if you search for it, if you Google it. But this is the one that I wrote and the one that I'm going to be talking about. Now, why write another gospel? There are 4 gospels, actually 5 gospels that are accepted by scholars as containing the accurate historical teachings of Yeshua, or through which they can be derived. That's the Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and also Thomas. Now, the oldest version of the entire New Testament, as we know it, is found in Codex Sinaiticus, dated to about AD 350 in the 4th century. This codex transmits teachings of the early churches about Yeshua, not the teachings of Yeshua. The teachings of Yeshua have been modified to fit into the evangelists' worldviews. They are read uncritically in modern churches to support ecclesiastical doctrines. They do not represent the Yeshua of history. Now, modern Christians need to know the authentic teachings of Yeshua, which is why I wrote my book called The Pre-Christian Teachings of Yeshua, which you can also purchase online. The ministry and teachings of the historical Yeshua should be illuminated by the insights of modern biblical scholarship. The sayings should be translated in terms of the original Hebrew-Aramaic vocabulary and idioms used by Yeshua. And the teachings of Yeshua should be made easily accessible and available to anyone who can read English. So here's how I wrote the gospel. I used only what is known about Yeshua's childhood, the most likely genealogy from the exile and the event at his bar mitzvah pilgrimage to Jerusalem with his parents. Instead of choosing between the 3-year mission of John's gospel and the 1-year or shorter mission in Mark, Luke, and Matthew, I strung together all the teachings with probable life settings for them without respect to time. I incorporated fictional narratives from my book Yeshua, the Unknown Jesus, when necessary, but used them mainly at the beginning and at the end. I also supplied copious footnotes to assist in hermeneutics and interpretation for both the laity and clergy. And to that end, I also added the glossary of Hebrew-Aramaic terms that originally appeared at the end of my novel Yeshua, the Unknown Jesus, and later in the pre-Christian teachings of Yeshua. And I also included among the sayings of Yeshua those reported in credible early sources outside the canonical Gospels and Thomas, such as the Didache, Clement, Papias, and Justin Martyr. So my book accesses information about the childhood and family of Yeshua. The Gospel of Matthew begins with a genealogy for Jesus, as I've shown in Pre-C number 27, exploring the patrilineal Aaronite or Levitical priesthood, familial priesthood of Yeshua. Only the lineage from Zerubbabel is likely to be historical, so I begin with that. That is the last third of that lineage in Matthew. Trained as a stonemason in Babylon during the exile, Zerubbabel established the first training guild of Jewish stonemasons and led the return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple about 550 BCE. And this does show that the Tecton Yosef and firstborn Yeshua were guild stonemasons by patrilineal succession. As the oldest son, Yeshua would have been initiated into the stonemasons guild as an apprentice after his bar mitzvah at the age of 12. And as was traditional, after the firstborn had taken his bar mitzvah, Yeshua's family would have taken him on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and the temple for the Passover festival. The legend in Luke's Gospel of the 12-year-old Jesus disputing with the Judean sages, later they were called rabbis, is probably historical, so I've included it. And the part that I have included is a fictionalized version of the event that I have written in other places. Now, YESHUA was probably a disciple or friend of John the Baptist. I'm going to talk about, and I talk about that in the places that I've written narrative about YESHUA's childhood, John the Baptist, the retreat, the rejection in Nazareth, the coming to Capernaum to pick up disciples and his first disciples. I have decided that, with many other scholars, that YESHUA was probably a disciple or friend of John the Baptist. Josephus tells us this: the soul of those to be baptized was by John the Baptist was thoroughly purified beforehand by righteousness. In other words, this was an initiation for those who had prepared and made themselves righteous. So I include a fictionalized narrative for YESHUA's probable historical relationship with the Baptist and his baptismal initiation, or mikvah, in the Jordan River. The idea of the baptism of John is for anyone who wanted to come out and receive it at that time, as presented in the New Testament, is not accurate. In the next chapters, I provide a fictionalized narration of YESHUA's pilgrimage into the desert wilderness and his return to Nazareth. I also provide a narrative about his rejection in Nazareth. In a following chapter, I provide a fictionalized narrative about his visit to the fishing village of Capernaum, meeting with Peter and Andrew and the healing of a child. And there he makes his first disciples, who were all employees of Peter. And this concludes the main narrated chapters, and from then on, the Gospel of YESHUA presents these authentic historical teachings as I've been able to recover and translate them, and as I've presented in other books. Now, YESHUA's teaching in the Gospel of YESHUA that I've written are presented as public or private, and they're made accessible to anyone because they're in English and they are presented in terms of whether they go directly to the disciples or to crowds of people. YESHUA's first teachings were given publicly from Peter's fishing boat to the crowds on shore. He taught the Basor, the gospel that he was teaching, to crowds in Galilee, but often the sayings that he needed to explain later to his disciples privately. And I explain the terms and meanings and footnotes for all sayings. To those who chose to follow him, YESHUA taught his halakha and practices. Chapters 8 and 9 present sayings about the Malkuth, or sovereignty, not kingdom of God, as it's usually wrongly translated into English and New Testament Greek. Chapter 10 presents an authentic mashlim, mashlim and dovrim that were usually taught privately at a meal. And chapter 11 presents others as taught in public or privately. And chapter 12 presents the sayings of YESHUA about death. And the final chapter 13 narrates the death of YESHUA and visions of his kima, his resurrection. A glossary of terms is appended at the end. So the Gospel of YESHUA is available in bookstores as an ebook and paperback. It can also be purchased from me directly. It can be purchased as an ebook or paperback for $9.99 at Amazon or Kindle, plus shipping. And you can go to this site in order to find the information about it. Or you can search Keizer, the Gospel of YESHUA, not to be confused with several others, because there are several other authors who have written books like Yeshua's Gospel and the Gospel of Yeshua, and all these will come up in a search, and you have to look for the one by Keizer. And the best thing is just to go to this thing up here, the Amazon.com product site. I have also purchased 10 of the books myself that I can sell to you directly for $15 a piece. If you go to my Gmail and request that sort of a thing, then we can work out the arrangements and I can get your address and send them to you myself.